Welcome to the Four Corners series for Workers and Resources Soviet Republic, and we're picking up on the 17th of June 1914. Now, if any of you are familiar with European history, you'll be aware that we are rapidly approaching the first major event that leads up to the sequence of events which then result in the World War One. Now, the reason the game is on pause is that I want to talk about the format of this video and maybe several successive videos, because what I want to do is start talking about those major historical events. Now, the format I've decided to go for is that rather than try and talk over the gameplay, because some of the issues that I'm going to need to talk about are going to be quite complex, and what I'm going to be doing is pausing when we get to certain key dates so that I can talk a little bit about the historical context. I think this has two advantages. One is that I will be putting timestamps for anyone who wants to jump forward who is not interested in the actual historical events. And the second one is simply that it will allow me to concentrate on what I'm talking about rather than watching the game. So this means that this video will consist of two parts: the historical discussions and the actual gameplay. Now, I'm aware that this format might be a little bit controversial, so if you've got any opinions on the format in any way that I can improve it, feel free to chuck it in the comments. As I've already mentioned, June is quite a significant month in 1914. I think before I can start talking about the events that lead up to the First World War, I want to talk about the political situation in Europe at this time. Now, the reason for that is that when I first learned about the First World War, I think I was taught the same way as most people do. You learn about the assassination of the Archduke and then the various events that got up to the war. But one of the problems with that approach is that if you don't understand the political structure of Europe in 1914, none of that makes sense. Once I realized that I didn't understand that political structure, I had to go back and completely relearn and reevaluate the events that led up to the war and what actually happened during the war as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the political structure of Europe at that time. And so what I want to do is start by talking about the political structure of Europe, so that hopefully that some of the things I'm going to talk about in this video and successive videos will make sense. Now, of course, this means that what we're going to get to is the first timestamp, which will be appearing now for anyone who wants to jump forward into the gameplay. If you decided to remain, welcome, and I'm going to apologise in advance that this section may get a little bit confusing, because and I think it's very important that when you think about this period, don't think about it in modern terms, modern relationships, otherwise it just will never make sense. So let's just get into it. And probably the best point to start is to point out that Europe in 1914 consisted of five, what you could call today, superpowers. That was Russia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Germany, France, and Britain. Now, these five powers were actually subdivided into two groups which had common treaties. I'm not going to call them alliances, because one of the other confusing elements of history related to the First World War is that people often list them as allies, and it's very important to understand that prior to the actual start of the war, these countries were not allies, because they were effectively five major nations competing against each other that had signed treaties that allowed them to work together, is probably the polite way of saying it. And I'm going to start with the German, Austro-Hungarian and Italian treaty group, because they're probably the stronger of the two, because obviously Germany and Austro-Hungarian had a very strong cultural tie, but at the same time you've got to have to remember that Germany was an up-and-coming power. Austro-Hungary was the fading old power that was running out of money, very much stuck in its ways. So even though technically they had treaties, it was more of a case of, well, I'll help you because we're part of the same cultural group, but at the same time I don't trust you completely. Now, attached to this group was Italy. Now, Italy were there more out of convenience, because prior to 1914, they took advantage of the Balkan Wars to grab a little bit of territory, which is now Libya today in North Africa. But they were very much aware that in order to hang on to it, they had to keep Austro-Hungarians on side. So that's the reason why they were part of that treaty group. Now, on the opposite side, you had Russia, France, and Great Britain. Now, this was quite a complex relationship, because The main reason for the treaties between these three countries wasn't because they were great friends. It's the fact that they were all colonial powers which rubbed up against each other. Of course, Britain had the biggest empire. French had massive overseas colonial influence. And of course, Russia had quite extensive colonies in the Far East. So there was a collection of treaties between these three countries that said, which was basically based on the principle of, if you keep off my patch, I'll keep off your patch. And if we get into a dispute, these treaties will allow us to sort it out without going to war. So that was the nature of the relationship. There was also a slight undertone based on the principle that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So that's something you need to understand. Now, on top of that, there are a number of other treaties that people need to think about. And some of these are literally aid treaties. And probably the most significant one was the fact that after the Second Balkan War, Russia agreed to provide aid and support to Serbia. Now, does that mean Russia didn't actually have a formal defensive alliance with Serbia? They just said that it's similar to what happens today, is that they would provide weapons and military support to Serbia in the event that they get themselves into a war, which was a bit of a risk, really, considering the strong tensions and regular conflicts that happens in the Balkans. But we'll talk a bit more about that in a little while. On the similar situation, you had the Austro-Hungarian Empire were providing military support to Bulgaria, who had already had a war with Serbia. And of course, at the same time, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina, which actually brought them into direct conflict with Serbia, because the Serbians had an ambition to create a Slavic nation in the Balkans, and that didn't fit with what the Austro-Hungarians were doing. So it's needless to say that as today, there was always a lot of tension in the Balkans at the same time. Now, if we pull out a little bit further, this is where life gets a bit complicated, but I think it's quite important to understand these relationships, because this is how what started off as a regional war that became a European war that then became a world war. Now, there was two big factors that kind of spread the war. What actually happened in early 1914, the Ottomans, after losing a lot of territory due to the Balkan Wars, formed a treaty of support, is probably the best description, with Germany. Now, another thing you need to understand is that France and Britain had lots and lots of colonies, and it goes without saying that should they enter any war, those colonies would come in automatically, and it's this element that adds the whole dimension of a world war. Now, just to wind this section up, I just want to talk about a very minor treaty that was signed in 1839, which will have a massive significance on how the First World War got started. And that was in 1839, the British signed the Treaty of London, which guaranteed Belgium's neutrality. Now, the reason the British entered into this agreement was the fact that they were very worried about German expansion into Belgium, which would then bring the German Navy very close to the British coastline. So what the British did was sign this treaty with Belgium, guaranteeing their neutrality. At the time, it was a very insignificant treaty, because it was really just kind of rattling the sabres is probably the best way to describe it. But it becomes very significant later on, as what we're going to talk about. And I think I've probably confused everybody sufficiently to the fact that we might as well get down and start actually playing the game. So now we're actually playing the game, we can forget about the European situation and concentrate on some basic mechanics. And as usual, though, a big thank you for your comments and feedback. You guys give me so much to think about. And I do need to give you a bit of an update. And what we got is the wood cutting post, which we were working on here, has now got its factory connection, which means we're getting plenty of logs in here to create boards. These guys have got quite a nice pile of logs, which is keeping the heating situation going. And what I've done is I've actually set up a route now which allows us to export boards. And if I come up here just to show you, I mean, it's still building up momentum, but what you can see now is we're exporting food, and the alcohol is now starting to flow a little bit, and we're also exporting boards. And if I come back to here, you'll see that we are now making kind of small but steady profit in relation to what we're actually doing. I mean, this area is working quite well. I think it's probably worth noting now that I'm quite happy with this village. I don't really want to add any more industry to this unless it becomes essential. I think I'm quite happy with this size. You can see we've actually got a population of about 1,000 with 583 workers. And what I will most likely do is add this apartment block on and this apartment block. But I think at the moment we, oh no, yeah, we still got a little bit of slack, but maybe we can start adding this on. But what I really want to do is shift the focus and start building this new village here. So this is going to be very much the focus of what we're going to be doing in this part. You can see this road, they're finally trundling their way through. And up here we've got our farm set up, we've got our distribution offices. We've now emptied these warehouses. So although we're on the 23rd of June, we still got, well, we don't have much in the way of crops there. Okay, maybe, but we still got the crops in the key building here. But we still do have crops here, which is ensuring that we've actually got a supply of food. I think we've still got some crops in this area here. So we do have a little bit of slack. But I'm resisting the temptation to ship the crops down into here, so we've still got some here. So overall, I would say that the economy is in balance. Now, I am building a distribution office here, and I've been making some open holes here, because what I want to do is when this distribution office is actually finished, we're going to set up some open holes to haul the bricks and steel from there up to here. And what I want to do is in stages. So rather than haul the bricks and steel all the way from here, we're going to haul it forward with a series of staging posts. So there'll be bricks and steel here in the event that I need to build anything in this area. I think overall things are looking pretty good. Like power wise, we've got everything on the green here at the moment, which is good. And one of the main focuses of this area is going to be gravelling in as many of these roads as possible. I've managed to get this done through here. We've got the footpaths, people are moving around the economy there. And I'm just going to pause the game because we are now on the 28th of June 1914, which is a very significant date. But before we start talking about historical event, I'm just going to run around and give you a final overview here. The only thing we're working on here at the moment is the corner market. So I'd like to build in these two roads here first. See, this one's being constructed. I think this has actually got a mechanism now for that, and this will be finished. So building out the village out here and getting these roads up and running is going to be the priority going forward. So what we're going to do now is talk about the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo on the 28th of June 1914. But before we get into the story itself, I just need to give you a bit of background. The first bit is that the actual assassination of the Archduke was not the reason for the start of the First World War. This is a very popular misconception that you will often read in history of the First World War. The second one is that the Archduke himself was not a very popular man in the Austro-Hungarian court. One, he'd married a woman called Sophia, who was, I think she was from Bavarian nobility, but she wasn't of the royal blood. So the very kind of stiff Austro-Hungarian court very much looked down on the Archduke as a social inferior. But of course, they had to deal with the fact that due to a series of deaths of his father abdicated and his cousin died, he was now second in line to take over the empire when the Emperor Franz Joseph, I think he was in his 80s at this time. So the Austro-Hungarian court had this kind of very mixed relationship with the Duke. So let's just get on with the story. Now, the Archduke announced a visit to Sarajevo back in the early part of 1914, something which, given modern security protocols, is not something that would be done, but that was the way they did it in those days. And it was announced that he would visit Sarajevo on the 28th of June 1914. Now, what actually happened was he arrived the day early, and they spent the day touring Sarajevo, just driving on an open car. And to give you an idea, given the tensions going on in the Balkans at that time, now that is probably the equivalent of a major world leader going to Afghanistan and touring Kabul in an open-top car. So that gives you an idea of what a level of chance the Archduke was taking at this time. I mean, he had very limited security because in those days there was this concept that the people, no matter who they were, would have respect for the ruling class. Now, because his visit was announced, there was a group, I think they were called the Black Hand, had plenty of time to prepare to assassinate him. And they were very well prepared. On the date of the 28th of June, when the Archduke and his wife were going to attend a formal luncheon or whatever, I can't remember what it was, not only did the people who intended to assassinate know the route, but they also knew the time when he was going to be driving by in an open-top car. So there was no security, no armoured vehicles or anything like that. So they were literally, and I think there was, nearly 9 different assassins stationed around Sarajevo. I think they were stationed next to bridges, waiting for the Duke to arrive. Now, what actually happened was the Duke drove over a bridge, and one of these assassins threw a bomb at his car, which bounced off the bonnet and wounded 2 of his security personnel, but didn't harm either the Archduke or his wife. Just to put this into context of modern terms, if you had an event like that, the whole area would be swarming with anti-terrorist police. The leader who was under attack would have been rushed off in their armoured limo to a secure location. But given this period of history, all the Archduke did was they shrugged it off and they carried on to the event that they were going to attend as though nothing had happened, just like you would if someone throws a bomb at you. So they attended this event, listened to all the speeches. When the event finished, the Archduke suddenly decided that he would go and visit the 2 of his guards who were wounded in hospital. His whole route was turned upside down and no one knew where he was going. So him and his wife and his small security detail sets off through Sarajevo. They didn't really know where they were going. And they went down a road, which I can't remember what the name of it was, and they took a wrong turn. And the guy who was in the car accompanying the driver said, "You've gone the wrong way, stop and turn round." And this is where you can say this is one of the points in history where a coincidence changes the whole path of European history, because the car stops right next to somebody called Garavino Princip, who is one of the assassins who had literally walked away thinking the plot had failed. And suddenly the Archduke and his wife pulls up alongside, stops. So what actually happens is Princeps whips his gun out, shoots Sophia, kills her instantly, then shoots the Duke, who dies soon afterwards. And if you read some versions of this history, there is a kind of attempt to give a sense of indignation amongst the Austro-Hungarian court that the Archduke was killed. But truthfully, he wasn't very popular. So the general attitude was, okay, he's shot. He shouldn't have gone to Sarajevo anyway, and it was Serbia. It's just one of these things that happened. And that was very much the consensus across most of the European powers. But, and this is the big but, this is the twist in the story, that in the Austro-Hungarian court at this time, there was a group of politicians called the War Party who were actively pushing for war with Serbia. And in fact, war with other countries as well. They were very much in the old imperial style. And one of the consequences of Duke Ferdinand's assassination was that despite all his conservative attitudes and being a bit of a man out of his time, but he did believe in 2 things. One was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and also he believed very strongly in not going to war. And the true significance of this assassination is that the one person who had both the power and the commitment to stop the Austro-Hungarian Empire declaring war on Serbia was now no longer in the picture, and the field was quite open for the War Party to push their agenda to drag the Austro-Hungarian into a war with Serbia for land in the Balkan states. And that's what makes this story so fascinating, besides the fact of the very casual approach to security. And I think this is the point to stop here. So what we're going to do is get back into the gameplay, and we're going to start playing again. And as I say, what we're working on is the corner market here. I'm wondering whether we can get some extra building go. If we've got vehicles sat around doing nothing, can we get some groundworks going? We could kind of try and get a quick win here with this building here. Yeah, this is just concrete, gravel, and a tiny little bit of steel. Actually, I think what we're going to do is not that. Let's come in here. What have I got aside? We got road crew, concrete pass, and bulk supply. Are you part of this? Let's see. We'll assign these, so it's just going to make it a little bit easier to assign this all as a group, I think. And what we'll do is we'll the hitbox with this. So we'll now assign that. I think that will give us a quick win to fill in any gaps that need to be done. See, these guys are waiting for a little bit of gravel. While I've actually been doing that, we've actually rolled on to July. And I'm just going to very briefly pause the game here. I just want to talk about something which is referred to in European history as the July Crisis. Now, the July Crisis is a whole sequence of events that actually run up to the declaration of war between Austro-Hungarian and Serbia on the 28th of July. But I'm not going to treat these as separate dates because I'll be swapping backwards and forwards and giving you lots and lots of random facts. But what you need to realise is that during this period, no one was really seriously considering war. It was more of a political crisis. What you did have knocking around in the mix is a guy called Conrad von Holzstaff, and he's actually the Austro-Hungarian chief of staff. Now, this guy is one of those very dangerous people in history, totally incompetent but very energetic. And to give you an idea, he previously suggested at least 20 plus times to go to war, and he was always kind of mediated and stopped by the Archduke. But of course now he's got free reign, and he's working on the Emperor Franz Joseph to promote his what he calls is his expansionist war against Serbia, because what he really wants to do is destroy Serbia. What I will do is just kind of mention the odd dates as we go through according to when things happen, because at this point what you've got is the kind of countries talking. There's all sorts of diplomatic mediation going on as countries try and, well, technically avoid war, but at the same time that the old traditional tensions are building up as they go along. And there's also at this time now is that some of the armies are not exactly mobilizing, but they're pre-mobilizing, because you've got to remember you're talking about 5 countries that had absolutely massive armies, and in 1914 it took weeks, possibly even months, to mobilize these great armies, bearing in mind that the main form of transport was actually trains. Anyway, let's get back to seeing what's actually going on. Apologies, I'm not really paying attention. So these guys are busy. These have got here. What I am thinking of is possibly opening up this bus station, because it's a bit nearer to where the action's going to be. And I think it's got contact. It kind of, I mean, it connects to all the main buildings. So I think that's exactly what I'm going to do, is we're going to open this up for workers. Then we're going to close this one down for workers. And then we're going to put this one onto here. Because the way I'm thinking is that the passenger wagons here can come down to here to pick up. Because what you've got to need to remember is that the time it takes for workers to get somewhere actually affects the amount of time they actually work in these areas. So the closer we can get these people into here, the better. Although it's going to take a little while for the population to adjust, I think. But that's okay, because if we make these changes, I'm also kind of starting to think that maybe we could put have this another little construction office here, where we can actually put the passenger wagons here, so it's going to be a bit closer to this area here. I know I keep dropping in kind of little construction offices into here, but I think it's, I mean, if I could get a small one in, this has got 6 slots. It'd be really brilliant if I could sneak that in there. Yeah, I think we're going to sneak that in there and come to here like that. I'm going to assign you there, and you guys can build that. And then what we'll do is we'll move actually I wouldn't mind maybe we can bring in another bus again. We'll start building another bus. We're going to need to put workers back in here again. Yeah, I think that will work advantageously. And then what this one can do is we can make this purely into concrete, and just keep the one covered hole for delivering electronics and mechanical components. How's this guy going? Is he actually going to finish? He's nearly there. Where are you off to? Oh, it looks like he's out of fuel. Isn't this one working, or is it just that this one's closer? Something tells me we're going to need a feeder here as well, because we've got a feeder there we got a feeder here and a feeder here for these trucks. Maybe we need to put a feeder here. I think compared to gas stations, these feeders need to be a bit more, how can you say, closer together. I think we are going to put another feeder just in here. What I want to do is just going to put a little road up around the back of here, like that, so that we encircle the fire station and the feeding station, and then that means we can put some buildings out here without any complications related to these buildings here. So if we get that built there, how are we doing down here? I mean, overall, I think we're doing pretty well. We got gravel there. Maybe I'm taking too much in the way of, I don't know. We've got 28 tons of logs there. I think it's just kind of fluctuating slightly here. We actually a little bit worried about the fact that we've got no workers here. We've definitely not got any workers here. I think we'll rename you New Hope Lane. I think what we might do is I'm just going to assign you guys to the bus stop. It's a bit risky, but I feel that we need to get a few workers in here in order to be able to get some stuff built. We've kind of woken them up now. Maybe we just needed to give them a little bit of encouragement. How are we doing for roads? We got these roads up here that are being built. I don't really want to overload these too much. I mean, I wouldn't mind a few footpaths in here as well. See what we got in the way of footpaths. Got one here. I think we're trying to sneak a footpath in there. That should get picked up, and we're assigning you that footpath as well, just in case it needs a little bit of extra support. Once we got this road finished, this road finished, this road finished, and we can't. I think what we're going to do is I'm just going to remove this footpath here, this footpath here, this footpath here, footpath here, and then we're going to delete the road through here. And because the trucks have got to come a long way, so there's no point just doing very short lengths. We need to try and do these in long lengths. I'm just going to pause the game for a reason which I'll explain in a little while I do this allocation. We can assign this, not these guys, assign these guys to deliver the gravel out here to here. Now the reason I paused the game is just for a little bit of a historical update. And now the 25th of July is a very significant date, because this is where everything starts to fall apart. Because on the let's just run it in historical sequence. On the 20th of July, France agrees to back Russia in whatever Russia wants to do. So you're now starting to get the beginning of the formation of the formal alliances. But at the same time, Germany has effectively given Austro-Hungarians a blank check to say, whatever you do, we're going to support you. So you've now got an alliance. But at the same time, the Kaiser has gone away on holiday, so he's not really keeping track. I mean, this is one of the great mysteries of the time, that considering the mounting crisis, that most of the German high command went away on holiday, so they weren't really following events, what was going on. On the 23rd of July, the Austro-Hungarian Empire issues an ultimatum to Serbia with a whole load of conditions. Now, there's only two conditions that have a really great significance. The first of the demands, the Serbians were still prepared to accept. This was a demand to effectively clamp down on what would be now a terrorists were acting within their country who were attacking the Austro-Hungarian bodies in Bosnia-Herzegovina. In some ways, the Serbians were quite comfortable with that, but the final one was a bit more of a sticking point, because what the Austro-Hungarians were demanding was that their representatives would take an active part and lead these investigations inside of Serbia. Now, anyone who's familiar with nationalist politics, the idea of another country effectively operating inside of your own country to do with law and order and deciding who is going to be guilty and who is going to be tried was unacceptable then as much as it's unacceptable today. So what actually happens on the 25th of July, which is the reason why I stopped this date, is that the Serbs respond to the Austro-Hungarians saying they're prepared to accept all the demands except for the last one, but what they were prepared to do was go to arbitration. Quite strangely, the powers that be were quite happy with that, except for one notable exception, which was the war party in Austro-Hungary. This is the situation now on the 25th of July, that the Serbians have effectively accepted the ultimatum with one proviso, and most of the powers in Europe are quite happy that this is acceptable, and none of them actually envisage going to war. And this is the incredible thing, that even at this late stage, that all the main powers in Europe don't feel that they're actually going to war. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start the game, but we're going to play slowly now, because we are now creeping up towards the key date, which is the 28th of July. This is when it all starts to kick off. In fact, we'll just let it run forward a little bit faster. I'll just try and keep an eye on the date. Apologies, I'm kind of splitting my attention, but I think we're going to be okay here. Of course, we haven't really started the harvest here. Wow, look at that. That didn't take long, did it? That's great. And this is obviously taking a little bit more time. I think what I will do is come here, and we're just going to assign. I think we can start building the fire station as well. And I'm just going to slow the date down, the game down, as we run into the 28th of July, so I can have a look round while we're playing. And of course, we haven't started the harvest yet. And I think we'll have a quick look at the economy. Yeah, so we're still making a small significant profit as we go forward. Is this still being built? We need boards. Do you have these guys assigned to it? Let's check. Right, we're now on the 28th of July. I'm just going to assign. No, you're assigned. So we've now reached the 28th of July. Now, this is the significant date, because this is the date where the Austro-Hungarian Empire actually declares war on Serbia. And I want to emphasize, they're only declaring war on Serbia. They're not just declaring war on anyone else. And there's a very interesting minor fact that goes on this day, is that Kaiser Wilhelm's finally come back of his holidays. He gets to read the Austro-Hungarian ultimatum, and quite amazingly, he reads through it and he sees absolutely no reason for war. In fact, he puts an entry in the margin saying this is okay, no reason for war. Now, 1 hour later, the Austro-Hungarians actually declare war on Serbia. This gives you an insight to the mentality that is actually going on at the time. So what we're going to do is just start the game now. And what's actually happened now is the Austro-Hungarians are at war with Serbia. But you need to remember that in 1914, it would take weeks to actually start mobilizing the army. So nothing happens. It's not like shock and awe, or like when the Germans attacked Poland in the Second World War. Nothing really happened. I mean, the Austro-Hungarians and the Serbians didn't even engage in any battles, because, of course, they had to mobilize as well. So in some ways, you're now entering a period of what you could call a phony war. And I think what I'm going to do now is to speed up the game a little bit now, because we're going to have to run through a few days quite quickly, and we're not making much progress with the game, actually, strangely enough. So we're still building this. And it's also worth mentioning that things are starting to heat up quite quickly now. And you can see the harvest is coming. And of course, in our little remote village, we wouldn't even know that we were at war at the moment. Life would just carry on as normal. And I think that applied to most of Europe. Just wish we could, if we could build this. I'm not actually sure why we're not getting the boards delivered here. Why? Was it the fact that these haven't got the groundworks going is causing the problem? Yeah, I think it's because the groundworks are not finished here. I could really, I mean, these guys probably don't have a spare capacity. Okay, let's just assign you. See if you can. You don't have it. I mean, you've got a couple of spare cranes there which could actually go. Apologies, I've paused the game again because I just want to talk about the 2nd of August 1914, because this is the point where the First World War gets real and the escalation starts now. Because up until the 2nd of August, it was very much a local war in between Austro-Hungarian and Serbia, but the other countries are mobilizing, and Germany's been getting a bit nervous because they don't want to fight on two fronts. Because you've got to remember, this time Germany went all the way east through Prussia and actually buffered Russia, because unfortunately for the Poles at this time, Poland didn't exist. It was actually divided between Germany, Russia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And what actually concerned the Germans at this time was the fact that they had enemies on two fronts. They had France in the west and Russia in the east. And you've got to remember is the Russian army was a very sophisticated army. It's a very big army. So you're not talking about a conflict between superior forces. You're talking about a conflict growing now between very powerfully armed countries. And of course, you've got to remember is the Russians were mobilizing, already starting to mobilize, and they were mobilizing, and not just down in the south to support Serbia. They're also mobilizing up in the north to defend against Germany, because they knew that Germany and Austro-Hungarians were there. And this is, as I say, this is the point in the war where things get nasty, because unfortunately for Belgium, who are neutral technically, they have this unenviable situation that they've got the one piece of flat land that allows armies to move, especially at this time where there's railways. That's the reason why, even back to the Napoleonic days, Napoleon went through Belgium to get to Germany and vice versa. So Belgium's in this very difficult situation that the path from Germany to France is through Belgium. And this is where the treaty I mentioned earlier, the Treaty of London, comes into force, because you've got to remember the British are guaranteeing Belgium neutrality. On the 2nd of August, Germany states their intention to occupy Belgium. And what that means is Germany now comes into direct conflict with England, who up until this point wasn't particularly interested in what was going on in Europe. They didn't really want to get involved in the war down in Serbia because it wasn't part of their political influence. And even the French, even though they'd signed an agreement to support Russia, they weren't particularly interested in war. But this is where the war starts to get hot. And this is the reason why one of the big theatres of war, what's called the Western Front. But you also got to remember there is also an Eastern Front when Russia invades Germany from the east. So this is where the war takes a dramatic shift north to the natural combat plains of Europe. And so we're just going to unpause here. I'm just going to let the game run forward. And so the tensions are heightening up now. Germany's mobilising, building up their forces to invade Belgium, which has got absolutely nothing to do with the war. But that's just the fate of Belgium, I think. It was repeated in the Second World War as well. I say the harvest is coming and we should be getting some crops coming into here. I just want to make sure that these guys are picking up what they've got there. What should be happening, these guys are out collecting. They should be starting to deliver crops into this area. I just want to make sure that they're going to be... Where are you going? New Hope fabric crops. I think what we're going to have to do is just knock out the blacksmith and New Hope food storage for the moment. We need you to unload into the silos. That's silo 1. Yeah, I made a bit of a mistake here. I'm just going to unload into silo 2. Medium field. Titusville silo there. But actually, I think if we probably just kind of unload into the silos, that should be okay. Because the Wagons do tend to go to the nearest location, and then what we can do is add the other ones on as time goes forward. So we're now actually on the 5th of August. Now, apologies, I've actually missed the date now. On the 4th of August, Britain formally declares war on Germany, and the Germans actually invade Belgium. This is where the war does get deadly serious now. The first major casualties and conflict of the war is actually in Belgium, who had nothing whatsoever to do with the overall strategy. They had no intention of getting involved. They were strictly neutral, and they are the first country to really suffer. You've got to remember, at this point, the Austro-Hungarians haven't even got around to mounting a serious invasion of Serbia. So it's the Belgians who take the brunt of the initial action in the First World War. And there's actually a very disturbing period that starts now called the Rape of Belgium. Yeah, so when Germany enters Belgium, they invade, and of course the British aren't ready to defend because they still got to mobilise their armies and get them into France. So Belgium is very much on their own. What actually happens is that the Germans invade, and they're pretty brutal in their invasion. But one thing I do want to emphasise at this point is that I'm not trying to make out the Germans are the bad guys, because to be honest, the war at that time was pretty brutal and indiscriminate and took very little consideration of the needs and survivability of citizens. If citizens got in the way, no matter what force was coming through, they often paid the ultimate penalty. So that's something you want to emphasise, that although it's called the Rape of Belgium and a lot of atrocities happened, those atrocities were going backwards and forwards throughout the First World War, especially as it spread to other theatres. And this is something that I think it's quite important to understand, that the war has now gone from a regional war to a European war and is rapidly expanding into the World War. Fairly soon you're going to find that the Japanese get involved, and of course there's going to be wars in the colonies. So the war does spread right out across the world. And I think I've probably gone on way too long for this video. Apologies if it's too long, too short. I've got no ideas, and I think this is where I'm going to stop. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it interesting, and until next time, whatever you do, enjoy your gaming.